Welcome, everybody. We're so excited to see your names trickling in here into our attendee list. Welcome to today's webinar on gender-responsive correctional interventions and the Women's Risk Need Assessment. My name is Valerie Bagley. I'm the Chief Program Officer here at the Change Companies. Really excited to welcome our special guest, Dr. Emily Salisbury, for a presentation on gender-responsive correctional interventions and the WRNA. A couple of very quick housekeeping items before I introduce Dr. Salisbury. First is, just so everyone knows, there will be no CEUs offered for this webinar. Second, recording will be sent to all registrants on Monday, including some of the references to materials that we'll share in today's webinar. You're welcome to share this with others. And then finally, there's a Q&A panel. As questions come up throughout this webinar for Dr. Salisbury, feel free to drop those in. We'll do our best to answer as many questions as we can. All right, without further ado, next slide, I'm going to introduce Emily. So Dr. Emily Salisbury is an associate professor and director of the Utah Criminal Justice Center at the University of Utah College of Social Work. She's the research director of the Women's Risk Need Assessment, or WRNA, instruments. She's an applied criminologist with a focus on correctional treatment interventions, especially for system-involved women. Dr. Salisbury's research centers on correctional policy, offender risk assessment, treatment strategies, and gender-responsive and trauma-responsive care. She's received the Marguerite Q. Warren and Ted B. Palmer Differential Intervention Award from the American Society of Criminology, Division of Corrections and Sentencing, and has also served as editor-in-chief of Criminal Justice and Behavior and co-authored the book, Correctional Counseling and Rehabilitation. You can see we're in for a real treat with today's presentation. So I'm excited to share, or introduce rather, Dr. Salisbury. Oh, you're muted.
Of course, right? Apologies. Thanks so much, Valerie. You'd think I'd have this under control by now. I appreciate you so much, and I really appreciate the Change Companies inviting me to be here today and to share some knowledge about justice-involved women. Of course, I'm not the only one on the call with loads of expertise around system-involved women. So thank you so much to everybody on the call who's been doing incredible work on behalf of justice-involved women and justice-involved men and boys and girls. I think folks in corrections in the nonprofit sector oftentimes don't get enough recognition. So thank you so much for your service and what you're doing for each one of our communities and public safety. Thanks also to the Change Companies. So excited to be here. I've been able to visit their site before. Their offices in just Carson. You're in Carson City, right? You're not quite in Reno. Yeah, in Carson City. And I got to say, this is a company that I feel the need to say, this is a company that really puts their heart into their work, and they don't just talk the talk, they really walk the walk. So it's a pleasure to be a part of this today. Thank you so much. So let's talk a little bit about, right, why do we have to talk about justice-involved women in a different kind of way in comparison to justice-involved men? There's so many different reasons for this, and I think if I had to guess, many of you on the call have seen your caseloads increase pretty significantly with those who are justice-involved women. The massive increase in the number of justice-involved women who are incarcerated and on community supervision has exponentially increased, of course, in the last 40 to 50 years. And so, right, there are practical reasons why we need to have the conversations and why we need to think about how this population just looks and feels really different. In my time doing this work, I have spoken to so many correctional staff and nonprofit staff who work with women in reentry spaces. And, you know, I've learned over many, many years that there are just some things that feel the same, or look the same on paper, like substance use, but actually manifest itself in very different ways across gender. So one of the first things that I want to talk about is, you know, the fact that women are far less violent and exhibit lower risk levels in terms of recidivism compared to men. So this doesn't mean, of course, that women are not capable of being violent, women are not capable of being dangerous, that they don't exhibit aggressive behavior in certain situations. But on the whole, it's really important to think about the fact that if we looked at our system with justice-involved women in mind, we would recognize that they are far less dangerous. They're far less likely to commit person-centered, really violent crimes. And our systems and the ways that we think about our policies and strategies should just recognize that fact. And in reality, just trying to advance slides, it takes a second. One of the best predictors of crime is actually gender. So we know that when we look at really lethal violence, who are the people that are generally committing these lethal homicides? Like, these data come from the FBI's, sort of uniform crime reports that talk specifically about homicides using a firearm. And you can see here that the female perpetrators of this event, this crime event, this tragic event, is not typically women. This is just one example, right? And I think sometimes a visual is really important to sort of see this. So in other words, because gender is such a strong predictor of future antisocial or criminal behavior, where like men are far more likely to engage in criminal behavior than men, if this criminological fact isn't recognized in the development of our policies, procedures, assessment instruments, programs, right, it serves to treat women as if they are just as dangerous at that sort of baseline level. And we all know, I think we might all know, that women's base rates of offending, like their likelihood of engaging in recidivism, are well documented to be far lower than men's. And so this is referred to as what we call the gender crime gap in criminology. And yet, of course, the incarceration of women, especially marginalized women, has been increasing, right, again, due to changes in policies that have widened the net for admission to prison for nonviolent offenses, right? The types of offenses that are more often committed by women. So decades of compounded societal neglect in addressing trauma, substance use, mental health, these are disproportionately, experienced by justice-involved women. And so we have to start thinking about how these are recognized in our systems. So what else? I just started to talk a little bit about this, right? Another aspect of justice-involved women's lives is that they do suffer from significantly higher rates of co-occurring disorders and substance use and mental illness, far higher rates of interpersonal trauma and victimization, and higher rates of post-traumatic stress disorder and complex PTSD, as well as complex needs. So the reality also is that substance use is a stronger predictor of women's recidivism in comparison to justice-involved men. They're both important and crucial to tackle and of course, related to criminal behavior and antisocial behavior. But by treating substance use in a gender-responsive way, which we'll talk about shortly, is actually going to have more bang for your buck in terms of reducing women's recidivism. The fact that they have higher rates of co-occurring disorders and substance use, mental illness, means that we need to be doing a lot more in terms of thinking about delivering trauma-informed care with this justice-involved population. Because for women, what we know, many of you will know this and will resonate with some of you, the substance use, the mental illness, and the trauma oftentimes come together in the pathways for justice-involved women to recidivism that just simply looks different for them than justice-involved men. So one of the examples is that we hear women so often say that they are numbing out from the emotional, physical, and abuse. And that's how their sort of onset of substance use began, or they were introduced to substances by family members or intimate partners in their lives in order to connect with their partner or their family as a way of having familial or intimate partner connection. Whereas for boys and young men, we oftentimes hear that, you know, they'll start substances for the thrill of it, for the fun of it, for the curiosity of it. And, you know, these are generalizations, of course, we're making, but this is what the data tell us, that the onset of substance use, the onset of mental illness, the onset of how trauma, mental illness, and substance use operate with justice-involved women simply looks different in comparison to justice-involved men. Far higher rates of interpersonal trauma. I'm convinced we're not having enough conversations about trauma and victimization with any of our criminal justice populations. And for many reasons, this field of gender responsive corrections was intentionally called gender responsive because we had hoped 20 years ago when this was all developed that it would actually start to inform what we do with justice-involved men and boys as well. The reality is women have far higher rates of interpersonal trauma throughout their life course, throughout their developmental period, as well as into adulthood. So that starts to look different. I also say that the kinds of trauma and victimization that girls versus boys experience, again, these are generalizations. They're not true for everybody, but what the data tell us is that when boys are abused as children, it is often, though not every situation, they're frequently harmed by people saying, I hate you, you're no good, in a very adversarial sort of way. When girls talk to us about their kinds of victimizations as children, they're oftentimes telling us that they were victimized by somebody saying, I love you. This is what love is. This is how we interact in an intimate way. And so the distinctions of that and the societal sort of gender norms that we have for men and for women, and of course, those are changing rapidly with gender expansive people and the beautiful ways that people are expressing their gender, right? That has consequences, of course, for how women will continue to potentially enter into harmful relationships that are just not good for them. So we'll talk about what's covered on the women's risk need assessment. And of course, we do measure interpersonal trauma and PTSD as part of those complex needs. What else is different, right? Can't talk about women without talking about trauma and victimization, of course. The amount of victimization that these folks have experienced, I don't think I could have survived. But we also have to think about the fact that they're primary caregivers of kiddos, of children, right? That close to 70% of justice-involved women are mothers of caregivers, they're mothers of children under the age of 18, and really struggling to navigate oftentimes with the parental role, the sort of vocational workforce role, and then their different multiplicative identities beyond motherhood. And then, of course, adhering to conditions of supervision, if we're talking about in the community. So the fact that they're primary caregivers of kiddos creates, of course, some unique circumstances in terms of specific responsivity and access to transportation, of course, being one of them, access to childcare, right? And the issues around failure to protect. There's 42 different states in the United States that have laws against women, against parents' abilities to protect their children against harm. And if women are put in really terrible decisions, to terrible situations where they have to make hard decisions about who's going to caregive for their kiddos if they don't have an intimate partner who's healthy, they have to make really tough decisions about who will take care of them. So that, coupled with trauma and victimization, what love is, right? You're starting to see a picture, if you don't have it already, of course, with working with women, about why we have to have these conversations in a different kind of way. Repair of relationships also are primary motivators for behavior change for women. And what we mean by that really is that women are just simply far more relational in nature because of the way we're socialized, because of the way that, you know, the sort of mothering figure that we expect so many women to have in terms of gender norms. Of course, that's changed and dramatically as women have had more voice and choice over the last 40 years. But we still have these expectations, and women still want to connect in different ways in their communities and with people around them. So women are socialized to be relational. We're socialized to want to care about relationships and to practice those muscles, so to speak, around healthy relationships. And oftentimes, of course, the population that we're working with does not know what a healthy relationship looks like because they never were exposed to it. It was never modeled for them. And women's identities and sense of self-worth is oftentimes wrapped up in the kinds and qualities of relationships that we have with other people. In gender responsive strategies, we train folks that that's a strength, not a weakness. The fact that we want to have relationships, but many women don't know how to have healthy relationships. And so that becomes a critical component and is actually a primary driver in criminogenic need on healthy, intimate relationships of how women get into trouble, right? Nearly every infraction in a women's prison is related to relationships. We're socialized to be relationally aggressive, oftentimes, not necessarily physically aggressive, although some women that we work with are socialized in that way. And I think, one of the best quotes that I've seen that really speak to this in the best possible ways is this woman named Carol Gilligan, who's a famous social psychologist from Harvard. She says that masculinity often implies an ability to stand alone and forego relationships, whereas femininity connotes a willingness to compromise oneself for the sake of relationships. Of course, both of those strategies entail a loss of voice and relationship. And so, right, men that we work with oftentimes are not practicing those muscles of being relational and emotional because of gender norms and other reasons. Whereas women, we oftentimes will give up ourselves for the sake of relationship. And so it's also really crucial as part of programming to think about what is that client's relationship with herself? What does it mean to be doing the work internally? Because this is actually some of the hardest work that we can ask justice-involved people to do, is to think about, where the pain, shame, and guilt lives, substance, and how that's related to substance use, mental illness, trauma, right? So many women feel like they are not worth investing in because they've been told over and over again they aren't worth it by people in their lives. And so to build that self-efficacy is actually really crucial with many justice-involved women. And I just want to share one sort of example of this from when we were developing the WRNA, right, the Women's Risk Need Assessment. One of the things that we saw with women who we were sort of tracked them from prison environments into the community upon release. We asked them when we talked to them about their self-efficacy, and so many women who had high levels of self-efficacy within the institution were written up more because they had a voice, they knew how to use it, they asked questions, they were verbal, right? We know women are far more verbal, which is a strength, not a weakness, but they do take more time on caseloads. Like those same women who were written up more because the officers just weren't trained to work with women in the same kind of ways. Those same women who we followed into the community, that self-efficacy was actually a protective factor for them because they knew how to get things done. They knew how to advocate for themselves. And they felt that them and their families were worth investing in and doing the hard work. So that becomes really important as well. And then one more example about relationships, this idea that when we were, again, conducting the early research 20 years ago with the Women's Risk Need Assessment, when we asked women who were incarcerated, what are you worried about when you get out of here, right? We held so many focus groups and interviews with justice-involved women and with staff. We asked them, what are you worried about when you get out of here? Talk to us. And over and over and over again, we heard, I was in this, I feel like I've got a handle on some things, like I've been in some decent programs with my addiction, but I'm so worried that I'm going to get out of here and it's all going to fall apart. I'm just going to meet up with Johnny again and things are not going to go well. And that told us, of course, the importance of relationships in thinking about how do we measure that? How do we think about it? How do we prioritize treatment strategies? So what is the Women's Risk Need Assessment? And, why do we want to sort of talk about the WRNA and the WRNA aligned curriculum, of course, from the change companies? The WRNA is an instrument that is really one of the only validated peer-reviewed risk needs strengths assessments, specifically designed for justice-involved women from the ground up with voice and choice from justice-involved women. If you're hearing a lawnmower, it's because things are going on around the house. Apologies for that. We've implemented in over 80 jurisdictions. I'll show you shortly some of the places that we've implemented in the United States and globally. But it's intentionally designed to address the criminogenic needs that are predictive of women's pathways to offending and women's recidivism. It's a collateral case file review like many other risk needs assessment instruments. An interview, and unlike other assessment instruments, it's trauma informed. So we train our staff who end up using the WRNA and train end users to deliver a trauma informed interview because of the nature of the questions that are going to be asked in this assessment instrument. It's intentionally designed to address women's criminogenic needs and mobilize their strengths. So one of the other defining features of the WRNA is that it identifies several different strengths that we can leverage in case planning to start motivating women in a different kind of way and understand that, of course, everybody has strengths. Everybody has whatever they need within them to make behavior change every day. It's the heavy lifting and it's hard work. It's deep work, but we start with a positive psychology and strength-based approach with a WRNA. And finally, it's endorsed by the United Nations to adhere to what's called the Bangkok Rules, which are United Nations minimum standards of treatments for incarcerated women and non-custodial women who are justice involved in the community. So it's essentially, right, the human rights that are afforded to justice involved women. And every day that we're not adhering to the Bangkok Rules, we're actually violating women's human rights. So this is, again, not a flavor of the week, flavor of the year. For a long time, when we were doing this work over the last 20 years, it was, there were quite a few challenges with thinking and considering how does WRNA fit and how does gender responsive fit with an understanding of the what works literature, the overall sort of risk, need, and responsivity perspective. And so I'll talk a little bit about that here momentarily. But importantly, this is not a new tool. It's been around 20 years. It was originally funded by the National Institute of Corrections from the U.S. Bureau of Prisons and U.S. Department of Justice. There are 3 different versions, one for prison environments and an intake version, one for which is intended, that version is intended to predict institutional serious misconducts for women. The second version is the pre-release version, which you would give somebody before they release from incarcerated settings in order to predict and think about what treatment needs they have for release. And then, of course, a probation or community version that's for post-release or community supervision strategies that, again, is intended to predict community recidivism for women. There's no cost to the training and there's no cost to, the license agreement, but of course there are associated costs for the training. But once an agency is trained, right, they can run with it as much as they want. It's a tool that's in the public domain. Another defining feature, right, of course, are what we actually measure on the risk needs assessment tool here. So we have every sort of criminogenic need, gender neutral, male-based need that you would expect to see on any assessment instrument like an LSCMI or ORAS or COMPAS. But we also, of course, include the gender responsive needs that we see are actually criminogenic and predictive for justice involved women. So you're not going to find things like, everything in the middle column in some ways, in the ways that it's measured on gender neutral assessments. Yes, you'll see employment and financial, for instance, but the way that we measure it, as opposed to other gender neutral assessments, is we recognize that women are oftentimes taking care of children and they can't work a full-time job. So yes, that's still a risk factor in terms of their employment and financial, but they may be taking care of elders. They, we understand that the needs and how women are still socially and economically marginalized in our society, particularly women of color. That's factored into the design of the assessment instrument and to that particular scale, right? Women still make 80 cents for every dollar that a man makes, and then you just start disaggregating that by gender and race, and the numbers get even more scary, right? Of course, we're measuring abuse and trauma and PTSD, as I mentioned earlier, because it's so crucial and so much part of their pathways to criminal behavior, that we have to recognize that if things don't get measured, they don't get treated, right? So those abuse and trauma questions are intentionally embedded in the middle of the interview and are for yes/no questions. They're not intended to dig into any kind of trauma and victimization that woman has experienced. And it's merely a flag for additional clinical assessment, just like many other risk needs assessments and these scales, right? So that becomes important to mention as well. Parental stress, right? Thinking about what does it mean to be navigating as a mother in this system and the stressors involved, and what programming can we put in place around parental stress? And of course, the gender responsive strengths that you see here as well. As I said earlier, we've implemented in a number of different states. This will need to get updated soon because we're about to train North Dakota Department of Corrections here shortly. Excited about that next month. There's one site in Oklahoma that uses it, but it's not the DOC. That's the Women in Recovery group out of Tulsa from the George Kaiser Foundation. There's a few other states here too that we'll get to, I'm sure, in time, but we've implemented in 80 jurisdictions. And if you see it in red here, it means we've implemented in some way, shape, or form within that particular system or within that particular state. I've had the pleasure of also training in Singapore, the Singaporean prison service, the Namibian prison service in Africa, the Czech Republic, as well as England. In fact, there are a number of studies going on right now in the UK to really look at validating it specifically for the Ministry of Justice and for working with justice-involved women there. And finally, I just kind of want to talk to this issue of, gosh, where does gender typically lay or lie? Where does it sort of get subsumed under in the risk, need, and responsivity model, right? Like if you know R&R backwards and forwards, right, left and right, you may remember that gender is relegated to a specific responsivity factor. That gender, our curricula, our programs need to take women into account and to think about what sort of needs are different. Essentially, I mean, our data and research and the evidence around doing gender responsive strategies from 50 years of research in corrections, criminology, public health, social work, psychology, addiction studies, women's studies tells us that risk, need, and responsivity actually, like, gender should be at the forefront of what that means. That gender shouldn't necessarily be just considered a barrier to treatment. Right? Like if the system had started with women in mind, these principles might look a little bit different. Now, my opinion and my informed opinion really is about R&R does apply to justice-involved women, but each one of these principles starts to look a little bit different, especially if we're, again, as I started our conversation, thinking about how, women just simply don't pose as much of a risk as justice-involved men. And what we see with gender neutral assessment instruments is that even if they are considered predictive or have predictive validity as part of their validation for women, they oftentimes do what we call, they actually overclassify justice-involved women oftentimes. So that means that these systems oftentimes will keep women on higher levels of supervision than is really warranted by their behavior. And that's actually a violation of the risk principle. If you think about it, if you're following me still, right? Like if we know that women actually are far lower risk, but we're going to hold them on higher levels of supervision, that's a violation, right? The need principle starts to look different for justice-involved women because we know, again, moving back to this slide, that women actually have different operationalizing how it works and operationalizes in their lives, different needs in comparison to just the big four and central eight. Those are still crucial for justice-involved women, but what are the gender neutral assessments that you're working with missing? And then, of course, responsivity needs for justice-involved women become different as well, including general and specific responsivity. Happy to answer more questions about that, but I did want to just turn it over now and back to Valerie.
Thank you so much, Emily, and thank you for that incredible information and presenting that research and the background in such a thoughtful way. I think you've answered this really well across your presentation, but the question I'm going to answer here is, does gender responsive programming and interventions, do they actually help? So we've just learned about assessing risks and needs of women, how that looks different than assessing the risks and needs of men. Using assessments like the WRNA, we know can help us identify those gender-specific treatment targets and focus areas, and this can then inform which programs and curricula get recommended, including, very individualized at-the-desk interventions done during one-to-one sessions, and certainly for group programs as well that can be beneficial. So I wanted to share just a little quote from a recent brief that was published in the National Institute of Justice called 5 Things to Know About Women in Reentry. What it says is gender responsive interventions that include mental health components, treatment for trauma, childcare, and parenting classes are associated with reduced recidivism and increased treatment retention following release. Female-specific programming that incorporates cognitive behavioral therapy, mutual or peer support, or all-female group sessions is recommended for women experiencing reentry. Let's jump to the next slide. This is where I'm going to share a little background. This is knowledge that led the Department of Justice, the Federal Bureau of Prisons, to allocate new funding under the First Step Act to develop a range of curricula for their Women and Special Populations branch in the Reentry Services Division. So the Change Companies was able to work collaboratively with the Bureau to help develop many of these gender-responsive interventions. And this is where we had the pleasure, and I personally had the pleasure of being able to connect with Dr. Salisbury, whose research background, wisdom, advice, thought leadership really helped us ensure that these curricula were grounded in those evidence-based principles and pathways to prison that we've been discussing on this webinar. So after completing this curriculum library specifically designed for women, we were able to look back and step back after a couple of years and see, wow, these materials really do map onto the WRNA domains in a very precise way. And so with that, we were able to come back together with Dr. Salisbury and her team and create what we're now calling the WRNA collection. So the WRNA collection uses the evidence-based practice of interactive journaling. Some of you are familiar with the practice of interactive journaling, having worked with the Change Companies over many years. But as we know, this is an approach and an intervention that uses the stages of change, expressive writing, motivational interviewing, a cognitive behavioral approach. And then we're combining that with target topic areas specifically designed for women, and aligning those to those individual need areas on the women's risk need assessment. So just a quick example, if we jump to the next slide, if employment is a risk area that comes up for a woman on the WRNA, we might recommend what's called the Women's Career Exploration Program. This is a curriculum that teaches strategies that can help justice-involved women start working toward overcoming some really common employment barriers for women experiencing justice involvement and succeed in the workplace. So it takes participants through this framework of increasing their self-efficacy. They're taking an inventory of their strengths, their skills, their interests, then learning some of those tactical skills, networking, interviewing, applying for jobs, landing the position, keeping the job, and adapting to a workplace culture. On the sample page I have up here, you can see participants are learning strategies for addressing their criminal background in an interview. So very context specific to the needs of women who are also justice involved. And then finally, if we jump to the next slide here, just wanted to provide everyone on this call a quick link where you can go access and view the WRNA collection on the Change Company's website, and also be able to download this crosswalk that you see on this slide. We will be sending these things out alongside the recording, so watch for those, but this is where you can go to learn more about those constituent interactive journals for each risk need domain. Okay, now, without further ado, we've had some really good questions come through both in registration and here on the call today. Thank you, everyone, for posing those questions and for the thoughtful way you're thinking about this information. Something that we observed as those questions were coming in during registration is there are just a few buckets of categories that people are curious about. One is, what's the relationship of WRNA to traditional instruments? So we will maybe touch on that. How is the WRNA designed? How do we design programs and interventions around the WRNA? Staff training, and then some questions have also come in about how do we support our transgender participants or gender nonconforming participants using what we know about the WRNA. So, let's pick a number on where to start here, but maybe you've already spoken to this a little bit, Emily, but maybe talk about, does the WRNA truly replace traditional instruments like the LSCMI, or is it being used to supplement a traditional classification instrument?
Sure. Yeah, so we oftentimes are, even though we have we originally created a trailer version of the WRNA years ago. We've actually found that so many agencies that we've worked with end up adopting the full version and use it to replace their gender neutral assessment tool because it ends up enhancing prediction of recidivism for their justice involved population. So it is intended to replace an LSCMI specifically for women, or a ORAS, or a gender neutral assessment instrument. I think I've talked a lot about too how it varies, how it's different, the WRNA in particular, from gender neutral assessment instruments. I did want to get to the question about trans populations and gender nonconforming and gender expansive individuals. I get asked the question every time I deliver any kind of workshop, and so I appreciate it very, very much. If there aren't policies and procedures in place specifically for gender expansive people and for trans populations in your agency, I'd encourage you to think about what those policies need to look like. My short answer to that question is, because the WRNA measures trauma and victimization, PTSD in complex interpersonal relationships, that agencies oftentimes find that it more accurately captures the lives of people who are gender expansive and trans populations. But I will say it's not been validated with trans women or trans men in particular. I would love to run that study and work with you to do that if you're a site that has a large enough population to be able to get a sample size to do that, right? At the end of the day, we should be giving people voice and choice about which assessment instrument they want to have dictate their, every subsequent decision on their behalf, because risk assessment, it becomes really, really important to that person. So if you don't have a policy, that's the advice I give to people. Think about giving voice and choice about which one describing each one to the client and which one more accurately reflects their life in terms of the risk and strength domains that includes.
Great. Thank you so much. I know we're planning on wrapping up in about 5 minutes here, so let's see if we can pick a winner. Maybe speak about a few questions have come in both live and in registration about how do we start creating buy-in with our staff who are maybe uncertain about this new assessment, uncertain about gender responsivity generally.
Sure, yeah, it's an important question. So I have found that the implementation strategies of doing, adopting a WRNA or any other gender responsive interventions, such as, right, the curricula that Valerie's been speaking to in the WRNA aligned curriculum from the change companies, is that, like, having a strategic plan in place and understanding sort of what the agency wants to do on behalf of and improve the outcomes for justice-involved women becomes important. As you create implementation strategies and implementation teams, involve the staff. Please involve the staff. We can no longer take a train and pray approach with innovative evidence-based practices. We have to think about how do we really drive change, and how do we involve all staff, like select staff, of course, throughout the entire organization, to have voice about what's going to go well and what's challenging. Yes, there are plenty of mythologies about working with justice-involved women. They're too needy, they're too manipulative, they're too emotional, take too much time. That, to me, is merely a training issue about helping your staff understand the benefits of working with justice-involved women in a way that they don't know what they don't know. If they're not trained on how to work with justice-involved women, then of course they're going to continue to have those mythologies. And so getting staff involved, asking, and really involving them in the decision-making of implementation. The WRNA and the WRNA-aligned curriculum here work best in agencies that want to invest in more positive outcomes for justice-involved women.
Thank you so much. Before we jump to the next slide, I just want to read this note from anonymous attendee. Thank you. Thank you for joining us. This seems like someone who has some lived experience. After spending 14 and a half years in prison, both state and federal, it's amazing that people are finally addressing the difference between men and women and how to better help the female population with past trauma. This is something that was not done while I was in. I got SUD treatment and worked on some stuff, although having assistance on how to deal with stuff upon release was not something that was addressed with any of us women. So thank you, Emily, for the important work you're doing in changing that.
Absolutely. Women deserve better. Thank you for the comment.
Jumping ahead, let's look really quickly at some resources. Some of you have asked, where do I go to get this assessment? Where do I go to access this collection? So Emily, do you want to say a little bit about UCJC and the work you're doing over there?
Yeah, for sure. So the QR code will take you to our website at the Utah Criminal Justice Center. We are an interdisciplinary research center housed in the College of Social Work at the University of Utah. So that's where I'm at. I'm the director of UCJC. If you have research needs, even beyond gender responsive, right, that's what we do. But of course, we are the clearinghouse and the sort of center for the women's risk need assessment. So if you're interested in learning more about WRNA, please visit that site. If you're a data geek like me and you like to see the validation studies, all 12 validation studies are on that website as well.
And we will be sharing we'll be sharing the link to this site with the recording coming your way on Monday. I've also included the link here for the WRNA collection on the Change Company's website. You can go here to view that, and we'll also be sending that out in our follow-up email. All right, well, let's go ahead and wrap up. I just want to say thank you again, Dr. Salisbury, for joining us on this webinar, for sharing the really, really important work that you're doing around gender responsivity and effectively addressing the risks, needs, and strengths of women who are justice involved. We really appreciate you joining, and thanks to everyone who participated.